Right, good morning, and if you were here about an hour ago, I'd be saying a very warm welcome, because we were all melting. It was so sunny and hot. But the weather's actually meaning we're not going to be baked, hopefully, today. So you're very welcome. I'm Linda Locke, and I'm one of the 4 regional officers for safeguarding aligned to the North West District. My colleagues, I think most of you will know at least one of my colleagues. We've got Jack Watson at the back. He's aligned to Lancashire here, right? And we've got Helen. Here we are, Helen Bolton. Right, she'll get the biggest cheer because Greater Manchester Plus is the largest by area. She would have it say it's the best one, but Liverpool Plus, we are, and but also we have Jill Riley, who has very recently joined the team. She's not able to be here today, but she's joined the team aligned to Cumbria to do that. Now, my welcome is really reading out something from Heather Ferguson. She's our District Administration and Compliance Secretary Officer. You know, she works incredibly hard, but unfortunately has to send her apologies because she was meant to be doing this section. So she sent this for me to read. It says, "Good morning, everyone, and a very warm welcome to the North West England District Safeguarding Conference. I wish to," yeah, that deserves a cheer there. "I wish to offer my sincere apologies for not being able to be with you today. It seems that I've started a domino effect of illness in my household, and I'm now not only still trying to cover myself, but also looking after my little ones and not so little partner at the same time." Right. This has been a busy week for the safeguarding team in NWAD, with the district safeguarding group at the beginning of the week and this conference at the end, and not forgetting the important safeguarding work that takes place each and every day, and that's by really everyone here in the room, because as we know, safeguarding is everyone's responsibility. So whether you're here today with a hat on as your church or circuit safeguarding officer, or regional officer for safeguarding, we have our bosses with us today. Actually, we have Chris Lewis, who's the regional manager for the North West region safeguarding, and we did have. Has he moved? Yeah. Oh, we have Tim Carter, who's, I don't know, do we take courtesy at this point, Tim, or later? He's the Director of Safeguarding for the Methodist Church, and he's going to be speaking this afternoon. You're very welcome, thanks everyone. But we're here today to learn from the latest evidence and also to listen to lived experiences and, of course, to each other. And hope that the programme develops all of our knowledge, challenges thinking, and encourages us to consider how we may better support vulnerable individuals in our local contexts. Our key theme today is trauma-informed practice in safeguarding, and I can't stress the importance of this field enough in the context of the Methodist Church, as we strive to create welcoming and empowering environments for people to come closer to God in whatever way works for them. So Heather and all of us want to extend a special thank you to all of our guest speakers. We have Karen, Col and Helen, who we'll be hearing from during the day, and obviously Tim, and all the facilitators who've travelled to share their experience, and of course to everyone who's taken time out of their weekend to be here. Thank you. Right, so done a general welcome. I don't know if when you've sat down, you know what we're like as Methodists. We usually fill up from the back forward, right? So well done the front row, okay? But maybe you want to just spend a couple of minutes saying hello to everyone around your table. Just, who you are, which church you're from, what you're hoping to get out of today, and what role you have at your church. So just a couple of minutes for that. Hopefully you've had long enough. If someone's done lots of talking, like a certain person standing at the front here, then maybe you can catch up with each other later. We will be having breaks during the day and lunch, and if you're sitting here now thinking, oh my word, I've forgotten my butties, there are places that we can direct you to that very short walking distance from here. We've put some water at the back. If you are able and you're desperate for a drink and you're able to go downstairs if you find that the jug's empty, it'd be really helpful if you could take yourself down for that. Now, safeguarding obviously can be a very emotional subject that you're going to hear from today. So we fully understand that if you need to take a step out or you need to go downstairs, find a room, be quiet, that's perfectly okay. Just as it is if you feel that you need to stretch, you know, if you need a giving jip or something, you know, so please feel free to do that. But if you do need someone to go out with you, if you're feeling distressed, please let someone on your table or one of us know and we'll come out with you. We don't want to feel that anyone's unsupported today. If you're not hearing the mic or the speakers, it's very easy when you're speaking at the front for your voice to drop. So if you can just sort of give a wave or an indication, I'm sure the speakers will realise that that's not just you being totally friendly, it's like we can't hear you, so speak up a lot, okay? We're not expecting any fire drills, so you need to go down to the car park if there is one. Toilets are at the back and there are some downstairs as well if you have too much of that water at the back. And one question I know when I go to conferences is always asked is, can we have the slide shared at the end? Now, Karen, with her trauma-informed PowerPoint, said that yes, she's quite happy to share most of those, and they'll be hopefully going onto the NWED website in due course for that. I've put some paper on the tables if you want to make some notes. You're free to take the Bible emergency numbers, sweets, but we do want our pens back at the end, if that's all right. No, we'll do that. So really, without further ado, we're going to ask Caroline Ainger, missionary lead for Liverpool Plus, to lead us in our devotions. Thanks, Caroline. Oh, well done.
Morning, everybody. Thank you, Linda. In our opening devotions today, we're going to focus on the theme of hope, and we're going to use the idea of light. So you'll see that there's some tea lights on your tables that we're going to be using later as part of our response in these devotions. And our key verse for these devotions is from John's Gospel. It's John 1, verse 5, that reminds us that the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. I'm mindful as we gather this morning that there are some kinds of work that ask us to stay close to human vulnerability, and that safeguarding is particularly one of those. It calls us, doesn't it, to pay attention to what others might overlook, to notice when someone is unsafe, to hear what is difficult to hear, and to remain present when stories are painful. And each of us is asked by God to carry that responsibility carefully and faithfully. And I know that because of that, sometimes safeguarding work can seem quite heavy. There might even be moments when the realities we encounter seem to dim the light. Perhaps, for instance, if trust has been broken, or if systems have failed, if churches have not been places of safety, or when survivors have not been truly heard. So today we begin not with a denial about the reality of the darkness, but with honesty about it. Because, of course, the Christian faith never pretends that darkness does not exist. In the scriptures, there is darkness over the face of the deep before God creates light. The prophets are consistently speaking against the darkness when they speak up about injustice and suffering, and the crucifixion itself takes place against a darkened sky. But again and again and again, God's response is light. And that light is not a superficial brightness. It's not an easy reassurance. It's a holy, persistent, life-giving light. And that is the foundation of our hope today. Just want to mention briefly 3 things that light does. Because light in the biblical tradition is never merely decorative. It is always something that transforms. So first of all, we might notice that light reveals. Light exposes, it reveals, it tells the truth. And that says something to us, doesn't it, about safeguarding and our purpose today, that we want to develop communities where truth can be spoken safely. That requires courage of us. It also requires humility. We need to be ready to say as institutions and as individuals that we will listen, that we will learn, that we will do better. Light can, of course, be uncomfortable because it reveals that which was hidden, but we know, don't we, that concealment has never healed anybody. I love that within the Methodist tradition, there's always that sense of accountability within discipleship. People meet together, they meet before God with honesty. They ask difficult questions of themselves and of each other about how they are living and loving. And safeguarding belongs within that context, I think. It belongs within that spiritual tradition of truthful holiness. Holiness that does not protect reputation, but seeks to protect people. The second thing I want to mention briefly is that light guides. So a light does not remove every uncertainty, but it does allow us or enable us to take perhaps the next step. So many of us who are involved in safeguarding will know that that is the reality of our experience, that there are very rarely simple solutions or quick answers. There are very many complexities. Confidentiality, risk assessments, pastoral tensions, legal responsibilities, and human frailty. So sometimes the journey can seem unclear. We just need enough light for the next step and a trust in God to take us forwards. And perhaps that can be enough for us. So hope is not certainty about everything that lies before us, but it is about trusting that God is present with us and that we can continue faithfully forward. I do think that safeguarding itself is always an act of persistent hope. It's hope that harm can be prevented. It's hope that churches can become safer places. It's hope that survivors can be heard and honoured. And it's hope that communities can and will change. And finally, I want to suggest that light comforts. It doesn't just reveal and guide, but it is a source of great comfort to us. We know, don't we, that many people arrive in our church communities carrying wounds that might be invisible to others. They might come with a sense of fear, shame, loneliness, trauma, anxiety. So safeguarding is not just about responding to risk, but it's about responding to the individual and creating cultures that enable people to experience dignity and welcome and care and inclusion. John Wesley spoke of God's grace reaching every person before they even recognise it. He called it prevenient grace, pursuing grace, healing grace. What if safeguarding is one of the key ways that the church embodies the grace that Wesley spoke about and that transformed his life and perhaps has transformed many of our lives also? So safeguarding is not merely about policies or procedures. It's about attentiveness, it's about gentleness, it's about relationships, it's about healthy boundaries, and it's about places where people are treated and honoured as beloved children of God. Sometimes perhaps the most hopeful thing we can say or embody for another person is this: You are safe here. You matter. You will be heard. I wonder sometimes if those of us who are very involved in safeguarding can become weary. There is, I think, a great emotional labour in this work. It costs us, doesn't it, to walk alongside people who are suffering. It costs us to listen carefully. It costs us to make brave decisions. It costs us to be criticised for some of those decisions. And there might be some moments where we feel a bit discouraged, perhaps especially when change feels painfully slow. Just want to remind you of what the prophet Isaiah says, because this might renew our hope today. He says, "Those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall walk and not faint." Of course, that doesn't mean that the work is easy, but it does mean that God continues to work through each and every one of us in the roles that we have and in the responsibilities that we undertake. So I hope that today this conference is itself a sign of hope, that we gather because we value this work and we value one another. And all of our small lights matter. Just going to listen to a piece of music written by somebody who herself is a survivor, and it's Ray and it's Lifeboat. And during the listening to this song, as we renew our sense of hope in God, I invite you to light the candles that are on your tables, and then I'll offer a word of prayer. Let's pray. Jesus, you say to each of us, you are the light of the world, not because we are flawless, not because we always get things right, but because your light is entrusted to ordinary people who are willing to walk faithfully in love. We thank you for that call, and we recognise it as gospel work. God of compassion, we take a moment to pray for all who have experienced harm, abuse, neglect, or betrayal. Where memories remain painful, bring healing, we pray. Where trust has been broken, gently restore. And where voices have been ignored, bring about justice and a posture of listening. We pray to you for ourselves and all who work in safeguarding. We ask that you give us wisdom in complexity, clarity in decision-making, and courage in difficult conversations. Renew our compassion so that we may never grow weary. And we pray for the churches that we represent this morning. May they become places of safety and grace. May transparency overcome secrecy, accountability overcome fear, and may care for the vulnerable remain central to our discipleship. And if any of us feel tired, renew us, we pray. If any of us feel uncertain, guide us, we pray. And if any of us feel discouraged, restore our hope, we pray. Help us to walk as children of light. In Jesus' name we ask it. Amen.
Thank you, Caroline. Thank you. Right, now our first speaker I've known for many years because I worked alongside her as she was the chair of the Liverpool District Safeguarding Group. And our paths across numerous occasions, haven't they, Karen, to do that? But Karen has been a Methodist presbyter since 2004. Before becoming a minister, she was a secondary school teacher here in the UK and for voluntary services, VSO, overseas in Namibia. Her first degree was in psychology and sociology, subjects that she went on to teach at A-level. But during her time as a teacher, she began her counselling training. Her degree, counselling training and life experiences established an interest in trauma. For most of her ministry, Karen has served as a full-time chaplain, initially at the University of Portsmouth for 5 years, during which time she completed her counselling training and became BACP, I'm sure she'll tell us what that is, accredited. She then moved into mental health chaplaincy, where she worked for 2 years for South London and Maudsley NHS Foundation Trust, and then as a forensic mental health chaplain for Merseycare NHS Foundation Trust. She engaged, while she was in that role, with some of the most challenging mental health patients in the country, in high, medium and low secure units. She developed and refined her understanding of trauma-informed care during her 8 years there. Since 2023, she has worked as the chaplain for staff wellbeing for North West Ambulance Service, and she supports individual staff with the trials and challenges of life and their roles. She also supports the organisation in employing trauma-informed practice when responding to major incidents. And as I said earlier, she was the independent chair of the Liverpool District Safeguarding Group until the merging of districts into the North West England District. We regional officers of safeguarding here in the room have heard Karen for the last 2 years speak at our national connectional safeguarding conference, and it's my pleasure to actually have Karen speak, as it is all of ours here today. You will learn a lot, I promise you.
Well, if you're not asleep after that introduction, I thought you were going to read that. I didn't realise it was going to be read to you. So my apologies for boring you before you even start. We're going to be thinking this morning a lot about bodies. And one of the things I love about our faith is it recognises that we are embodied people. We are people who are not just being given a mind, not just being given a soul, but we've been given a body, and it's our body that interacts with the world around us. And because it's our body that interacts with the world around us, it's our body that can tell us about trauma. So we are going to be hearing some quite heavy-duty stuff today. We're going to be hearing from a lady who chose to be called Eve, and we have had that kind of dramatised for you. Initially, when we did it, it was an audio. It was myself and Eve talking, having a conversation, but we've had that dramatised, so it's a bit more objective. It's slightly less exposing for Eve herself. I want to give you a tool because you might be surprised by what gets triggered within you. Because trauma isn't just, you might be sat there thinking, well, I've not been the victim of sexual abuse, so I don't need to worry about this. Well, unfortunately, trauma can affect us in all sorts of different ways. So if you feel comfortable shutting your eyes, shut your eyes. If you don't feel comfortable shutting your eyes, just kind of get a soft gaze on something neutral. Don't be looking into the faces of other people. Just look at the table, okay? And let's just take 3 deep breaths in through the nose, out through the mouth. You might want to put a hand kind of over your heart area, over your chest, so you can feel your chest expand, and then just release. And then expand and just release. And we'll just do that to get us into our bodies and aware of what's going on with us this morning, and then we'll move on. Okay. So 3 deep breaths. Okay, and now very gently open your eyes and look around the room and notice 5 things you can see. 5 things you can see. Deep breath in and out again. And think about 4 things you can feel, not inside, not emotions. Start with your feet. What can you feel with your feet? And then work up your body. So, and just think about 4 things. And then deep breath in and out again. And think about 3 things you can hear. And then deep breath in and out again. And think about 2 things you can smell. Hopefully it's not a stinky person next to you, but you never know. And then deep breath in and out again. And think about 1 thing you might be able to taste. Okay, and then just gently come back into the room. So that's one of the ways, we call it a grounding exercise. If you find yourself getting triggered by anything that you hear this morning, then that's something that you can do for yourself to help your body to feel safe. And if your body feels safe, then your mind will follow. The other thing that I'd invite you to do, and this might sound really weird, but I went to a training with a lady called Carolyn Spring, somebody who both Col and I really, really love her work. And I've done most of her trainings online, but I went to a face-to-face one where she was sharing some really horrific parts of her story of childhood sexual abuse. And she invited us to imagine it going through our ear, through our body, and into our foot, and into the ground, okay? So it was being earthed. It's almost like a flash of lightning. You know, if you think about how a flash of lightning travels, it goes in through your head and then out to the ground until it finds earth. That might be a bit too weird and funky. I've worked with people who I've tried that with and they're just like, oh, Karen, that don't work. And that's absolutely fine. It's the same with all of these things. Some things work, some things don't. It doesn't matter. Take what works for you, take what doesn't. You've also got sweets on your table. Again, what you might want to do is just take a sweet into your mouth and engage with it mindfully. So taste it. Is it sour? Is it sweet? Is it hard? Is it soft? All of those things just to bring you back into your body, get yourself earthed, get yourself grounded. Okay. So we're thinking about trauma-informed practice today. This has become quite a trendy phrase. It's been used all over the place. And 2 years ago, somebody sent me a Facebook thing of trauma-informed Barbie, which I just thought was absolutely fantastic. So, you know, it had this kind of like when we were just getting into ChatGPT and all the rest of it, somebody had created this trauma-informed Barbie and she had all of our multi-sensory tools and she had this and she had that. It's everywhere. You will hear it all over the place. And some of you, when you get to the end of today, will think, well, I didn't learn anything today. I've been doing this for years. Great, fantastic. Some of you, hopefully, will be picking up on different ideas. So what is trauma? I particularly like this by Basil van der Kolk. He's one of the grandfathers of the trauma movement. So it's not just an event that took place sometime in the past. It's also an imprint left by experience on the mind, the brain, and the body. And it's the body that communicates it. It's the body that stores it. So traumatic experiences often involve a threat to safety or life. But it can be anything that leaves a person feeling overwhelmed or isolated. Even if it doesn't involve physical harm, it doesn't have to. We talk about psychological safety and psychological trauma. It doesn't necessarily involve the body at all in that sense. And this is really important, I think, for our churches. It's not objective. Over the years that I've been counselling, you know, and I sometimes find myself thinking it in the ambulance service, I can go from listening to a member of staff who has dealt with the worst job that you could possibly imagine to listening to a 22-year-old who's just had a spat with her boyfriend and is devastated by it. And they are responding at the same level of energy and intensity. And I have to keep reminding myself, it's not my perspective that matters. It's not my perspective that counts. It's the experience of the individual of the event. So, this is how Royal College of Psychiatrists describe it. It can take a few days, weeks, or even months to recover from a traumatic event. If someone is still experiencing some distress after a month, but these feelings are improving slowly, they will probably get better and not need treatment. However, if they're experiencing significant distress that's not improving at all after a month, or is still present after more than 3 months, this might be a sign that they have developed PTSD. One of the conversations I often have with staff for the ambulance service is, at the moment, you are in the TSD stage. Anybody who has experienced what you've experienced will understandably have experienced a traumatic response, okay? So a traumatic response is a normal human reaction to trauma. It does not become a clinical condition until it gets stuck. In the ambulance service, we use something, and I know the police and the army use it as well, called TRIM. So after a really bad job, then our staff are offered a TRIM assessment. And what it does is it tries to establish a baseline of, you know, maybe 48 hours after the event. What's happening to you? Well, I can't sleep. I'm feeling really angry. I'm feeling really tearful. I'm feeling really anxious. Okay, well, that's normal. Absolutely normal. And the best thing we can do for anybody in those circumstances is just say, this is normal. Normalise the experience. Anybody human, and I always say to my guys, until they replace us with robots, this is what they get, okay? And it's probably only a matter of, 30 years until they replace us with robots, but until then, they're getting humans. And a human is going to experience trauma in response to a traumatic input. If it's not processing through, the idea with the TRIM assessment is it's repeated after about 6 weeks. And we're seeing how they're doing, and we're seeing if they might be needing a bit of help getting unstuck with this. So, different ways that people can be traumatised. And I always struggle because I used the example, the first time I ever delivered this, I used the example thinking that we're in Britain and nobody's ever going to be held up by a gunpoint, only to discover that somebody in the room had been held up at gunpoint when he was working in a bank. So I'm going to use the example of bears, but again, you might have been chased by a bear, so forgive me because I just don't know I don't know what your stories are in this room, okay? So you might be chased by a bear and be in fear of your life. That's direct. You might be at a high point in the woods, looking out with your binoculars, seeing your friend being chased by a bear. You might, when you get back to the camp that night, discover that your friend got chased by a bear. Or you might see it on the news. Now, this is quite interesting, the repeated exposure. There's been some really, really interesting work done post 9/11. And what we know is that even people who were on the other side of the world or the other side of the US to New York when 9/11 happened actually had a trauma response. And the reason that they had a trauma response is because they watched the news again and again and again and again. And with social media, this is a real issue. I'm going to come to the example of Southport later on, but one of the things I was very conscious of when I started working for the ambulance service, Southport happened not very long after I started working for them. And I've had to really be disciplined in terms of what I expose myself to. I choose whether to watch things or not. I choose whether to read something or not. And I actually found myself saying out loud, when I saw a documentary was going to be on a couple of months ago, I give myself permission not to watch that. And sometimes we have to do that, because there's a kind of part of us, it's really drawn to it because we know the story and we know our understanding of the story. But also, we have to be quite wise and give ourselves permission not to actually expose ourselves to anything like that. Okay, so if you were being chased by a bear, something in your brain, called the reptilian brain in some language, or if we are being very posh and clever, we are talking about the basal ganglion part of the brain, which I can never remember, which is why I'm having to look and check I've got the words right. But basically, it's the part of our brain that hasn't evolved since we used to live in caves, okay? So this is the part of our brain that can be really tricky for us to manage, but actually it's the part of our brain that I am most grateful for, because actually it's a part of our brain that's allowed us to survive as a species. And without it, we wouldn't have survived, okay? So I've heard it described as a smoke detector part of our brain. It gets triggered, and it can get triggered quite easily. So if you were being chased by a bear, you would have some choices, wouldn't you? You could pick up a rock or a stick and fight the bear. You could just freeze because you're so scared of the bear that you just kind of get rooted to the spot and hope it doesn't see you. It works apparently with rhinos because they're very short-sighted, believe it or not. So if you kind of stand fairly still, you're all right. If you're moving, it can catch it. You can flop, you can play dead. If you've ever seen, a mouse or whatever, they're very good at this. They're quite small. If you play dead, you're less interesting to the prey. So that's an option available to us. Or you can fawn and say, please eat my husband and not me. Which is, not a bad strategy, I'd say. Now, forgive me for this slide. It's not the best, but it is the best I've found in terms of summarising what's happening with our bodies. So, if you think about what's happening with our bodies when we are facing a life-threatening event, well, what happens is our hair goes on end. Now, apparently, from evolutionary psychology, we believe that goes back to the day when we used to be very, very hairy, when we still lived in caves, and it makes us bigger. Our brain starts shooting out all these different hormones, and it's doing this in a very clever way. Our pupils dilate, better to see you. Our heart rate is increasing, so it starts pumping. Our stomach, the digestion actually slows. We might relax our bladder, which is why we wet ourselves if we're scared. We might poo ourselves if we're scared. Now, again, one of the facts from evolutionary psychology that I particularly like about this is one of the theories is because it makes us stinky. and less appealing to eat. So, which would make sense, wouldn't it? But also the fact that you're releasing anything that might be weighing you down when you're trying to fight or flee. And our breathing becomes very shallow, trying to get more oxygen to our muscles in order to contract, in order to run or to fight. All of this stuff, it happens without even thinking about it. It just is what our body does. So clever. So all of this is a healthy response to trauma. This is when we get into the realm of PTSD. Now, everybody who experiences trauma, as I said, is not going to develop PTSD. It doesn't work like that. So, if you have experienced these things, there is such a thing as a layering of trauma. So if you've experienced trauma before and then you experience more trauma, then you experience more trauma, the chances are you might experience trauma more deeply, even at a lesser trigger, or what other people might define as a lesser trigger. If you've got existing mental health conditions, if you are experiencing life stresses, again, if you are on the bones of your bum and you can't afford heating, you can't afford food, you can't afford to keep the shelter over you, then you are more likely to experience trauma. Genetics. There's some really interesting work done in the light of the Holocaust, on Holocaust survivors, intergenerational trauma. Did a really interesting course on it a couple of months ago. And what they're finding is it's carried down. And what I found, which really blew my brain, was that if a pregnant woman experiences trauma, she actually passes trauma not just to the fetus, but if it's a female baby, she passes it to any future babies that the fetus might have through her ovaries, okay? It's fascinating, it's scary, but this is how genetics can pass on trauma. The world is not a safe place. So if somebody is experiencing this, then they can communicate that. Now, obviously, there's psychological elements, which I'll come on to in a minute, which can perpetuate that as well. Obviously, if you're socially isolated, you're more likely to experience trauma. Neurologically, if you have a touch of the tisms, as my friend says, so if you are autistic, if you're neurodiverse in any sense, because the world, you have to work harder to make the world make sense anyway, to then make sense of trauma on top of that just gives you that much more work to do, which can be really hard. And the other thing that's not in here, which I wish was on here, is you're more likely to experience trauma if you are LGBTQI. Within mental health, we talk about these three factors anyway. So we talk about the interaction between biology, those things we've just discussed, psychology. So, I grew up thinking the world's not a safe place. I might pass that anxiety down to my kids in the way I get them to engage with the world around them and engage with risk. Social, environmental, I live in a really bad area. Kids around me are carrying knives. There's police out every night bashing down doors. There's drug dealers on every corner. It's a hostile environment. So if you have all of these things coming together, then the chances are you're more likely to experience trauma, understandably. Also more likely to experience trauma if you have these. Now, these in their own right are not necessarily saying that you will develop PTSD. They don't. I heard one presentation where the psychologist talked about having angels in the nursery. So, when I was growing up, my mum had mental health issues and various other things. There was various stresses around. But I was also very, very thankful that we had a lovely next door neighbour who is childless. And her and her husband became pseudo-grandparents for us. So they were our angels in the nursery. They were the ones who we used to go around to with our school reports. They were the ones where we used to go and talk to if we'd had a really bad day. So there can be people around you who can help to mitigate the impact of these adverse childhood experiences. And for me, growing up in the church, I had a room full of church aunties and uncles, for which I'm really, really grateful. So again, don't underestimate the role that you guys have to play. Now, if you were a conference, that would be money in the pot, wouldn't it? But thankfully, we're not at a conference. So, just move on. How does it keep the score? Disassociation. If you started writing your shopping list because you're bored, and I don't blame you, then you've disassociated. But there's different ways of disassociating. Basically, it just means that you stop being present to the reality that's right in front of you. Physiological arousal. You might find your heart beating really fast. You might find that your breath's really shallow. You're having a panic attack or whatever. Chronic pain. This is massive. Gabor Mate, who used to be a GP, who's somebody who's specialised in trauma, but also in addiction, really talks about the reality of pain and the lived experiences of pain and its relationship to trauma. Digestive issues. I get IBS, which is, it's really, really common. You find yourself really struggling to hold on to food. Movement memory. I was listening to a lady who was talking about having been knocked off her bike, and she'd been fine. She'd been absolutely fine until she'd been in a different situation where she kind of got a bit unstable on her chair and then suddenly found herself falling and then being triggered. And what she was being triggered to was the accident where she'd been knocked off her bike. And it was nothing that anybody had said. It was nothing like that. It was this movement, this particular movement had triggered it. Emotional flashbacks. I'm really crying. I'm really anxious. I'm really upset. And I don't know why. But you know that you're feeling it. You're feeling the feels. Fatigue, exhaustion, chronic fatigue, all elements of it. Somatic flashbacks, again, when your body remembers, again, talking to somebody who'd been triggered by being in Costco of all places, and somebody had leant over her to get something out of the fridge. And that sheer fact that somebody was behind her had triggered her, and all of a sudden her body was back to being caught from behind and raped. The immune system suffers because, again, your body's coping with too much, so your immune system is working too hard, so it's getting burnt out. Craving for food. Again, makes sense, doesn't it? If your body needs energy to fight or flee or fawn, because actually even if you're lying playing dead, that takes an awful lot of energy from your body. And non-epileptic seizures, the various names for this now. Functional, I think it's functional, is it? What's it called? Neurological functional disorder, I think it's. Functional. NFD, neurological functional disorder is what I think it is. I've heard it called different things. We used to have, when I worked for South London Maudsley, we used to have a whole ward of people who experienced NFD, and it was really interesting work. I did some of my most interesting work with people on that ward, and just listening to their stories and unpicking what it was that was throwing them, and literally throwing them into a place where their body felt as though it had no choice but to have a seizure. Right, I'm just going to take a couple of questions, if there are any, on this bit before I move on. Good, I'll move on. You've got a sense of... Okay, so this is going to be group work. Now, this is Eve's story, as I've flagged up. This is a real story. So, as you're listening to this, I want you to think about what you're thinking and feeling. What could have made Eve's experiences more positive? And did you hear anything that makes you think about your own practice? So that's what I'd like you to discuss afterwards in your groups. Okay. Thank you. Not long after we recorded the initial interview, Eve sent me this. Survivors aren't only healing from what they endured, but from the ways they were treated when they asked for help. And that just seemed to sum up her own experience. And it was also around the same time as Giselle Pellico was giving evidence at the trials for the men who abused her. And this was the strongest message that came out from what she was saying. Shame must change sides. Okay. So I'm going to give you about 10 minutes on your tables just to think about these questions. We're not going to feedback from all of the questions. The only thing I would ask for from each table is one word that sums up your responses. Okay, so don't feel as though you have to give feedback on all the questions. I'm not going to ask for that. And if you don't get to all the questions, it doesn't matter. The important thing is you're discussing it, you're thinking about your responses. Okay, thank you. Okay, I've been asked to repeat what each table responds for the benefit of the mic and the benefit of the recording. Okay, Phil, if we can start with your table. Just one word. Timing. Okay. Middle table. Appalled. This table. Disappointed but not surprised. Back table.
Shocked but not shocked.
Shocked but not shocked. This table. Two words were said there and I missed both of them. Tragic. And there was another word as well. I'll let you have two. No? Okay, this table. Independence. This table. Reflective. This table. Disappointed. This table. Shame. This table. Re-traumatizing. Sorry, the table behind you. Regret. Cole. Anger and silencing. Okay. All of these very true. So Carolyn Spring, I mentioned her work's excellent, and if you want to really get below the experience of the trauma survivor, I commend her to you. She is somebody who experienced the most horrific childhood sexual abuse you can imagine. She was impregnated, she had a forced abortion, she was part of a group sexual abuse scandal, all sorts of things. But the way in which she coped with that was by developing a really strong dissociative ability, to the extent to which she used to escape into the academic part of her brain. And she was somebody who went on to get a degree from Oxbridge. She is extremely academic, but a very effective communicator. And she writes and she teaches and she creates resources on abuse and on trauma now. So she says this: remembering is not recovering. We can remember and still not recover. We can recover without remembering. The indelible impression of trauma manifests itself in our symptoms and our behaviours. We jump at a sound. We feel hopeless in the face of mild threat. We flee at the faintest hum of conflict. That's what's going on in the body of a trauma survivor. And because trauma memories get really jumbled up, they don't get stored in the same methodological kind of memory filing cabinet of our brain as normal memories. What we often find is the fragments present themselves of the trauma story. Somebody might never, ever, ever fully be able to recall the incident of their trauma. What they will do is kind of get almost kind of pictures or sounds or sensations. I want to say a little bit about vicarious trauma, because all of you are here in your roles within the churches, and trauma can get into you. We used to have a saying when I worked in Ashworth: you can't work in a paint factory without getting splashed. So it does get into you, and it can get into you. And if you are doing lots of listening, or if you're listening to something particularly challenging, then you need to have strategies to keep yourself safe within this. So Babette Rothschild, again, her work I absolutely adore. She's an American psychologist and therapist. Workers can vicariously experience their client's trauma in their own nervous system. It becomes a risk when you're overwhelmed by someone else's trauma. Two ways that this can happen. There are others, but these are the two ways that I'm focusing on. There we go again. Focusing on for today. So, countertransference. My story starts to interact with your story. I often give the example when I'm doing inductions for our new call handlers, that again, until they're replaced us with robots, they're getting human beings, which means that there are going to be times when a call that you are taking interacts with your own story. And I'll give you the example of, my dad is living with prostate cancer. I was listening to somebody the other week who's also living with prostate cancer, but is much more advanced than my dad's. And I had to really concentrate on separating my story and my responses to what I was hearing the person present with. It's going to happen. It's going to happen all the time in all of our different elements of life, because we're human and our human stories interact. Mirror neurons is this very, very, very funky part of our brain. Our brains are so clever, called mirror neurons. It allows us to live in tribe. I don't know if anybody else is a big Radio 4 fan. There was something on the Today programme, I think it was last year, about the fact, it was a study done on apes by psychologists. Psychologists are really slippery people, You need to be careful of them. But they discovered, they already knew that if one ape in the troop, if that's a right collective noun, started to bed down for the night, then the other apes would follow suit. But what they did is they stuck in this hairy robot and got the hairy robot to bed down for the night, and the other apes still followed suit, even though it wasn't real, and they sort of knew it wasn't real. That's because of mirror neurons. We're programmed like that. There's also another study by psychologists, again, I emphasise that they are very slippery, where they did a study in a doctor's waiting room. And I think it might have even been a psychological study. So people thought they were going into a room to do a psychological study. What they didn't realise is the waiting room itself was a psychological study. So what they got is somebody planted in some of the different conditions. So different groups of people, different conditions. So in some of the conditions, they got a plant to mirror calm. So they were breathing really slowly, they were rooted in their body, they were somebody who was really used to being a mindfulness practitioner, and they were doing that without explicitly doing it. What they found is the blood pressure, the heart rate, everything else of the other people in the room with the plant went down. It didn't when they didn't have the plant in the room, okay? So your body, because of mirror neurons, and this is so important when you're working with people who might be showing symptoms of trauma, your body is your biggest resource. When I was training our volunteer chaplains a few weeks ago, this is what I was really, really trying to hammer into them. Your body is the best resource you have. You don't have to ask clever questions. You don't have to have the right answers. You have to model calm and being grounded. That's the best resource you can offer the person that you're listening to. Okay, help for the helper. I first read this probably when I worked for South London and Maudsley, so many years ago. But I love her work. And again, she's very, very practical. So what she suggests is you've got to know your body. You've got to know what you tend to do. So I'm asthmatic. So I was diagnosed with asthma, I think, when I was about 2.5 or 3. And when I am stressed, my breathing becomes very shallow. I might get wheezy. I also have eczema. So when I'm stressed, I have my eczema finger, which sounds really, really bizarre. But during the exam season, I knew my level of stress by how much eczema I had on my hand. If it was just kind of a bit of a dry finger, then that was fine. If I was really, really itchy and sore on 2 or 3 fingers, I was starting to get bad. When I was a teacher and got infected eczema on both hands, I knew that it was probably time to take some time off because my stress levels were too high. And actually, I really shouldn't be at the blackboard in cotton gloves writing, because I look like Michael Jackson, and we all know as safeguarding officers that's not a good thing. So you've got to know your own body, and you've got to know what your own body is telling you. You know, do you have a twitchy eye? Do your lips get really dry? Whatever happens, if you know your body, you know that you're catching the feelings. Practice mindfulness. Again, mixed feelings within the Christian community sometimes about mindfulness. It just means being aware, doing the 5 things, again, just to ground yourself so that you're grounded in order to listen to the other person's trauma. Enforcing boundaries, and this is something most ministers, including me, and counsellors have learned the hard way. We are nice people. We don't want to be mean. We want to help. So we say things like, ring me at any time. Is that helpful? No. Because you know what? You're going to get burnt out and bitter very, very quickly. We almost have to trust that the other person can survive, and then, again, let them catch our trust. So let's make sure, I can see you're really distressed, I can hear you're really distressed. I've got some free time at 9:30 tomorrow. Why don't we have a conversation then? In the meantime, who can you contact if you start to feel overwhelmed? Well, there's the Samaritans, there's Calm, there's whoever. You're not the only person who can fix them. And the minute you start to think you are, then you're screwed. Excuse my language, but you are, okay? So again, that boundary breaching, it happens so often with regards to safeguarding, because we want to help, we want to be nice, we want to be kind. But again, it's making sure that you can be really effective in terms of supporting them. Using rituals. So I, for example, when I finish a day, if I've been working from my office, I might lock my filing cabinet, I might put the key on top of it. When I worked at Ashworth, I can't imagine most of you being in Ashworth. I know 1 or 2 of you have for different reasons. But But it's a high security hospital, but it looks like Pontins, but not as depressing on the inside. So it's basically kind of individual low-level buildings. So when I was coming off the ward, there was like an airlock, and in each of the airlocks would be anti-bac gel. So what I would do as a reminder to myself, as well as infection prevention control, which is very important, is just wash my hands with anti-bac gel. And that was my reminder that what I'd heard on the ward stayed on the ward. Okay? And that's really, really important. There's a priest, a young female priest on Facebook, a lady called Jessie, and I was so impressed with her the other week. I was so impressed with her because she put on a post about how she'd broken confidentiality. Well, she hadn't broken confidentiality, but she'd broken somebody's boundaries and trust because she was still processing a story that she'd heard. She actually said to somebody, "Oh, I've just had the worst day, blah, 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 blah." She didn't name names, she didn't give specifics, but the other person said to her, "I'm not sure I should be hearing this." And Jessie, being very human, kind of got a bit of the ump, and it was just like, "Whoa." But then she went away and she reflected, and she thought about it, and she said, yeah, she was absolutely right to say that. That did not belong there. We all do it, we're all human, but actually, as we know from listening to Eve, it's very, very, very easy for stories to leak, and that does not help the survivors that we're supporting. Clothing and jewellery, probably more for the females, but, you know, the blokes will find their own variations on this, I'm sure. Because I'm asthmatic, I'm wearing a big tree today because initially when I start presenting, I get quite anxious, my breathing gets quite shallow. My big tree reminds me to breathe in and to breathe out and to stay rooted, all of those kinds of things. She suggests that you think about if you're working with somebody or a situation that's particularly challenging, that you think about where you experience that person in your body. So, for example, I'll let you know a secret, which half the connection is suddenly being let in on, but, you know, I will share it with you anyway. I have Wonder Woman pants of power. And I don't need to wear them today because I've got my tree, but I wear my Wonder Woman pants of power when I'm doing really difficult funerals. So if I am doing the funeral of somebody who's taken their life by suicide, or a particularly young person, or a particularly hard thing, I know they're there because I feel it in my tummy. My tummy gets all squidgy. I know they're there. I know that I have that little bit of protection between their feelings and me. This is not going to get into me. This is going to stay there, okay? So that's really important. And then using supervision well. Okay, folks, I've run over by a couple of minutes, so I'm going to let you go for your break now, and I will see you after the break. Okay. Hopefully you've had time to have a wee, hopefully you've had time to have a brew. We have been thinking about individuals now, but we're going to move on to thinking about our church community. So what we heard before the break is relevant in every context I've ever been in. Any kind of community that you're in, whether it's a choir or a drama group or whatever. We're thinking specifically now about church communities. And I'm going to share something from my own story. So my friend over there and I were just reminiscing on being ordained in Edinburgh, weren't we? And the retreat that we went on in Durham. But before that, you will be very aware, as good Methodists, that before you ever get to conference to be ordained, then you have to be declared worthy by your Methodist district. So back in, what year did you say it was? 2004? I always forget. So 2004, at Darlington Synod, as it was then, which was being held in Bishop Auckland. No glasses were needed. So I was sat there listening to the report on me being read out. And I found myself being incredibly, incredibly triggered. So if you'd have gone into the disabled toilet immediately after my report was read out, you would have found me curled up in a ball, shaking and crying, overwhelmed with a sense of shame, overwhelmed with a sense of not being okay. And that's how my superintendent minister found me, shaking and crying. Her response was not to ask, what's the matter? Her response was to slide down the wall next to me and sit on the floor in the disabled toilet, not holding me, just sitting on the floor next to me and waiting for it to pass through me. And then when it had ended, she said, okay, you okay now? Or are you getting better now? I can't quite remember what the question was, but it wasn't a what's happened here question. It was just a recognition that something had happened within me and maybe I couldn't quite articulate it. And at that time, I certainly couldn't articulate what had happened. So she helped me to stand up. I splashed some cold water on my face, very important, getting the senses back online, getting my body back online. And she said, what do you need? Do you want to go back in? I said, can we go for a walk first? So we went for a walk around the block. And this was before I actually knew much trauma theory at all. I still didn't know much trauma theory at this stage. So we went for a walk around the block. But what that did is it allowed my nervous system to be soothed because I was fleeing. As far as my body was concerned, I was getting out of the trigger environment. I was engaging with the world around me. She was drawing my attention to the beauty of the flowers, of the trees, of the things around me. And I don't think at that point it wasn't something that we really understood in terms of trauma theory. It wasn't commonly understood. But it was working. It was working to get me back into my body, to get me grounded again. And then we went back in. So, great, fantastic. I got over it, got ordained, went to Edinburgh, had a super time in Edinburgh, had it declared that I was worthy, even though everything in me didn't believe that, but, you know, whatever they say. And you know, from then, I became intrigued. I wanted to know more. I wanted to know more for my own sake, but also for the sake of the people I work with. And I did my counselling training. I started my counselling training when I was a high school teacher, but I actually went on to do the counselling diploma. 3 years, very full on, nearly as bad as Theological College, except I didn't have to live with them. But this time, I was having to have my own therapy for the 3 years that I was doing my counselling training. So I started to learn more, I started to understand more. But it still wasn't quite shifting it. There was still some stuff in me. And I understood my history because I'd trained as a psychodynamic counsellor, which is all tell me about your father and tell me about your mother and all that kind of stuff. So I understood my ACEs much better. I understood my adverse childhood experiences much better. I understood some of the things that had happened to me much better. But it was still in my body and it still wasn't shifting. So when I was working at Ashworth, I had the opportunity, some stuff started to really build up. And I very thankfully, very, very thankfully, was offered EMDR through the Trust, which is eye movement desensitisation and reprocessing. It's a very, very body-based therapy. So if you've seen it on the telly, you might have seen people waving the fingers around, you might have seen a light going from side to side, you might have seen all these different things. And I've got to say, it's the best thing I've ever done. And it did get me to a completely different place. And I thought I was cured. Hallelujah. Praise the Lord. Until I was at a minister's retreat last year not our minister's retreat, I was at a chaplain's retreat, and it was being led by an Anglican lady, an Anglican archdeacon. And she suddenly said, well, she didn't suddenly say, but it was all part of the planned day. She said, right, okay, we're going to do some reflection on Jacob's ladder. And I just want us to do a bit of meditation on this. Blah, 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 blah. And I just thought, great, because during my EMDR, an image that had helped me in terms of finding safety was actually being able to climb up a ladder. In fact, I can see a ladder there, which is quite surreal. Being able to climb up a ladder to safety. And that had been a core image for me, and that had been a really helpful image for me. So when I heard we're doing Jacob's ladder, it's like, oh, I like this story. This is a really good healing story for me. This is fabulous. My body thought otherwise. So knowing what I know about trauma now, I was much better. So I went into a side room to meditate on the passage. But I was stood up because everything within me wanted to curl up into a ball. I was consciously looking out the window. I was consciously counting things. I was using all my tools to ground myself, but my body was going for it. I was shaking, I was crying, I couldn't stop. But I knew that I just had to sit it out and it would work its way through. Now, somebody was walking past the door, one of the other chaplains, actually the airport chaplain from Speke Airport. And her spidey senses kicked in because I was looking out the window, so she couldn't see my face. So she walked past the door, and then she walked back again. And then she came in and she said, can I help? Can I help? Not what's the matter, what's going on, what's wrong, can I help? So I said, can you just stay in the room? Can you just stay in the room? And I knew I just needed that emotional anchor of safety. Somebody here is here, and therefore it's safe. So she did what I described earlier on. She was demonstrating that she was reading her Bible. I'm sure she wasn't. I knew she was watching me the whole time. But she was doing a good job of pretending to read her Bible. So the evidence, it didn't make me feel too exposed. It didn't make me feel too insecure. And then I got to the end of the trauma trigger, and it worked its way through. And I just said, okay, it's finished now. And okay, what do you need? Can I have a hug? Yeah. Not what's just happened. What's going on? What do you need? Sometimes people can't tell you. So sometimes that's when you've got to describe what you're saying. I can see you're really distressed. Would it be helpful if? I could see you're crying. I could see you're shaking, whatever it might be. So that's what's helpful. She didn't ask. She didn't need to know. But being in a room full of chaplains, I actually did something that I wouldn't normally do, and I took a risk. And when we went back to feedback, I shared what had happened to me. Because I thought, well, actually, in a way, I really appreciate how she was, but it might be helpful for her to know how much that meant for me to have her as a non-judgmental presence. And if you get nothing from today, I want you to take this away. We can't always stop people being triggered, but we can always be kind. If you take nothing else away to your church communities, I want you to take that, okay? So, again, I want you to just we're not allowed to say brainstorm, are we? I want you to thought shower on your tables. Apparently brainstorm is a clinical condition. So we should thought shower now. I want you to thought shower how you might see evidence of trauma present in your churches. And we're just going to do that for 5 minutes because we've got a little bit more to get through. Folks, I'm going to call us to order. It's the start of the conversation, it's not the end. Hopefully the conversation will continue from today. It's just been an opportunity just to start to get you thinking a bit. So Gabor Mate said this, is the GP guy. His parents survived, I think he's Hungarian Canadian, and I think I'm right in saying his parents were Holocaust survivors, or were certainly Jews during the time of the Holocaust. And I've used this quote a lot. After Southport had happened and we were going through various inquiries, including the inquiry from NHS England, I wrote to the managers who were involved in managing the scene and said this, because actually for the managers, their priority is always their teams. It's never their own mental health. So I wrote and said this, look, trauma's not what happens to us, but what we hold inside in the absence of an empathetic witness. And I hope that as a chaplain, I can be an empathetic witness to all that you've seen, all that you heard, and all that you had to do. And again, I think this is where we come into our own potentially as churches. We can be that empathetic witness. Some things that I think we need to bear in mind within our churches. How do we model relating and listening? Are we dismissing people? Are we cutting them off? If we do have to cut them off, are we giving the opportunity to revisit a conversation? Because we all know what it's like. In counselling, when I was doing my counselling training, we used to call it the door handle effect. So, you know, people are just going out the door and they just say, oh, and by the way, I, experienced this really horrific thing when I was 6. And I say, right, okay, so you've got to be able to know what to do with that. And you do not sit them down and start another conversation. You say, that's really interesting and really important. And I know we need to give that the proper time it needs. So this is when we're going to readdress this. And this is where we come back to it. Is it okay if we revisit it at this time? We needed strategies to handle that kind of thing. Do we take people seriously? I mentioned earlier the example of going from, listening to somebody who'd had to take a call from a 7-year-old who just witnessed his mum being murdered to listening to a 21-year-old who just had a breakup with her boyfriend, and having to really, really kick myself into this matters to her. Therefore, I need to take this seriously. Do we try and understand what might be going on for them? And this, I think, is one of the biggest things that actually presents in churches. And if we are curious, we have the opportunity to explore and be present and play with. And I don't mean that in a dismissive way. Oh, Edna is whinging again. Sorry, apologies to anybody called Edna. I never know what name to use. Edna is whinging again about the fact that the vase has been moved. And the vase that has been moved is really... And as the minister, you're just like... Oh. And I often say this is why I go into chaplaincy, because I don't give a stuff about the flower arranging rota. But it is that sense in which, well, what does this vase represent to Edna? What's going on for Edna? What is it she associates with it? And why is it so important? So actually having that curiosity to explore and to think, even though it's sometimes the little things that drive us mad as ministers or, stewards or whatever it might be. It's happening for a reason, it's there for a reason, and it's usually not about the thing it seems to be about. Anybody know the name for this image? You behave yourselves. You know the answer. Have a go, guess. What might it be? Washing the disciples' feet. I think that's exactly the title. I can't remember. I hadn't written it down. We used to have this hanging in the chapel at Ashworth until one of the psychologists walked in and said, can't have that. And I put it in the room where I used to do my one-to-one work with staff. And it became colloquially known as something that I will not repeat in this environment. But it involved a sex act and Jesus. Unless you see it, you don't see it. And if you have experienced that as a child or a young adult or an adult, and you've not had a say in that, then that can be incredibly triggering. So again, we need to think about what can we see, what can we hear, what can we touch, what's happening here. I'm very, very conscious now of what happens when people have to kneel in front of me for communion. And I give people a choice, because actually kneeling in front of an authority figure might be incredibly triggering for somebody. And we don't think about it. We don't think about it at all. I still, again, going back to our ordination, I can still remember the weight of those hands upon my head at ordination, kneeling in front of this person. Not part of my story. It wasn't a trigger for me. It could be if it's part of your story. Okay? So we need to be just a little bit more mindful of what some of these things might mean for people. And it's not to say we don't have to do it. It might be that it's worth having a conversation. I personally believe that Jesus still gets into you whether you're kneeling or standing. So, you know, it might be, if this is somebody's part of somebody's story, if you're in a position of authority and you know their story, can we give them a choice? We can just say they've got a dicky knee. We don't need to say anything else. Can we give people a choice at the communion rail whether to stand or kneel? And I, just as an experiment, when I was putting this together the other year, I actually started playing with standing for communion myself. And what I discovered is loads of people stand because they've got dicky hips, they've got dicky knees, they've got all sorts of things. So do we actually have to, you know, within all of this, it's a question of choice. And the more choices we can give people, the more they can control their own triggers, potentially. There's something really good came out of Eve's story that we heard earlier on. One of the things that happened is Tim wrote to her. And she was incredibly grateful for that. And that was incredibly healing for her, to have her story validated and understood and affirmed as real within the church. Something else that happened at the same time as we were producing this is she started to play with some resources, because she's quite a pragmatic person of how can I help to teach the church and help the church to get better. So she produced these May I resources, no touch without permission. Now, I am a hugger. I'm dreadful. And I actually said to Helen earlier on at lunch, at the break time, I'm really sorry, I've just touched you without permission. But I know Helen quite well, and we hug each other normally and everything else. But I think there is something about a rule of thumb here that we should be asking. We should be getting permission. Collective trauma. I mentioned Southport. I was chairing a meeting. It was the first meeting I was chairing in my new role for the ambulance service when there was a knock on the door. A consultant paramedic came in. Karen, can I have a word? And he just said to me, look, there is a mass casualty event happening at the moment. There's one child confirmed dead. It looks very likely that there's going to be a number of children killed. We're just wondering if you can get to the hot debrief. So my meeting was in Bolton. I had to get to Merseyside for it. And I was present in the hot debrief. And I can honestly say I have never heard, and I never wish to hear, things like that again from the paramedics who were on the scene, from the call takers and everybody else. It was a collective trauma. Now, that was my experience of working for the ambulance service, but at the same time, Marianne Kent, who was a super in Southport, was having to deal with the media. She was having to guide her church communities through this. She was having to do all of this stuff. The collective trauma took over the town, and it did, and it still is. They are still living with this. And I have to say that Sefton is still living with this, where I live, which is the extension of where Southport is. Collective trauma is the reality of every community in the country at some point. When I did this at the safeguarding conference, the National Safeguarding Conference, somebody was talking to me afterwards about having worked with survivors from Aberfan. That was his generations. You know, every generation has something that is going to be collective in terms of the trauma, and we need to be adopting the same care. This came out from Greater Manchester Resilience Hub. I will send you these slides, so don't feel as though you have to write anything down. But this came out after the synagogue attack in Manchester, and some really helpful stuff there. And again, important for children. I cannot tell you how much Southport is still impacting our schools within Sefton. It's huge. It's going on. But all of these are important, trying to create safety, trying to give choice, trying to moderate social media use. I had a really bizarre experience the day of the Liverpool football supporters attack when the bloke drove into the crowd. I went to Aintree Hospital and I was with some staff who'd attended. And I was sat in the back of an ambulance with a newly qualified paramedic who was absolutely in bits, understandably, and her colleague. And her colleague was in the cab. I was sat at the back with this young woman. And her colleague suddenly shouts, "So, hey, Karen, hey, such and such, you're on telly." And sure enough, social media was broadcasting this to everybody. And her parents were worried sick because all of a sudden her parents were seeing this in real time, that she'd been involved in this catastrophic event. So, you know, social media with all of its benefits is really, really quite unhelpful when it comes to trauma management. Racial trauma. I went to see To Kill a Mockingbird last night and I cried. I commend it to you as a play. It's excellent. But what struck me is just how relevant it is. It's based in the 1930s, but particularly in the current climate, which is probably why Aaron Sorkin, wrote the play to go with this particular production. It is so relevant. If you are a black or minority ethnic person in the UK, you are experiencing microaggressions on a daily basis. So therefore, if there is something traumatic happens, it's going to be that much more. It's compounded, okay? So again, we need to be particularly mindful if we are the majority. And in this culture, I am part of the majority. When I lived in Namibia, I'm very, very thankful I actually had the experience of being an Oshilungu, a white person, and walking down the street and having kids point at me shouting, white person, because I was a novelty. And I'm actually incredibly grateful for that, because I remember how that felt. And sometimes, again, we have to step out of our comfort zones as white people to recognise that. And sometimes that can come with a bit of risk. So again, after Southport, I got contacted by one of our trainers for our 999 operators, for the clinicians. So there's two types. We have two types of call handlers. We have those who are just generic call handlers who go through the computer program and everything else. But we also have clinicians, nurses and doctors and paramedics. And we just had a group of Indian nurses come over at the time of the race riots that followed Southport. Could I come and talk to them? And I'm thinking, okay, I'm a white woman called Karen who's middle-aged. Am I really the right person to talk about race? And I thought about it and I thought, well, you know what? I'd rather go and get it wrong and allow us to give voice to it than not do it at all and not acknowledge the reality of what is happening and how scary it must be to suddenly find yourself in a country where you think you're going to be welcomed with open arms because the NHS is on its knees, and yet you're in this incredibly hostile environment because there's all these race riots going on left, right and centre. It's real, and we need to be so conscious of it in our churches. We have that responsibility. Okay, again, just for 2 minutes, I've become a big fan of Barbara Brown Taylor this year. I can't believe I've not read her works before. I wish I could turn to the church for help, but so many congregations are preoccupied with keeping the lights on right now that the last thing they want to do is to talk about how to befriend the dark. Okay. 2 minutes on your tables. What gets in the way for churches?